Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot for, one, allowing us to interrupt the conversations, allowing us to interrupt the food, and of course, get back to the afternoon. You'll have noticed that we have slightly shifted the arrangement on stage, and we have a panel of panellists joining us. I find it helps to have a panel of panellists rather than anything else. But we just thought that if you've been to other impacts, either watched them online or indeed been here in person, you'll know that it's amazing listening to and hearing people talk about research, regardless of whether the actual subject matter is something that you're really focused on or find extremely interesting. The reality is that even if you don't, you know that somebody else in the room does. But the truth is we could do that all day, every day. There's just not enough time. There's so much research. But we want to be able to kind of try it where we can and just ask ourselves questions about how we might apply some of the things that we're hearing. And so with that in mind, we thought we'd bring some people on stage who would help us do that. But the truth is that you are also all kind of sub-panellists. The aim really here is for us to have a conversation that isn't just the five of us on stage, but really maybe draws out some thoughts and some questions from the audience as well. But we'll do that. So I'm not going to try and introduce everybody because I won't do that quite the justice that you will do yourself. But if I ask you maybe to just take 10 seconds, please, and we'll start with you and walk all the way down, and you could just tell everybody who you are.
Thank you, Oz. I'm D Gopal, and I work at the Open University. I'm the Deputy Director for Security Strategy and Culture. My team are the Engagement, Training and Awareness team, and we've been doing training at the OU for cybersecurity since 2012.
Thanks, Dee. James Vandenberg. I work at DLA Piper. I look after risk culture and engagement. Cyber is one of the main risks that we look after, but we're more risk agnostic, looking at human behaviour and risk management.
I'm Donna Huggett. I work for a company called Belron International, who you probably never heard of. Parent company of auto glass, car glass, all things windscreen. So I head up our training, cyber training and awareness programme.
And I'm Nick Allen from justeattakeaway.com. I'm an information security specialist who's previously written policy, looked at general controls, but now focus on human risk across the organisation.
Amazing, amazing. So a range of practitioners. I know there are many, many more in the audience as well. And some of you will maybe recognise similar parts of your jobs with the people on stage. So thank you very much, again, like I said, for joining us. So we've listened to 3 different presentations. Talking about 3 very different subjects. Just to remind either anybody who's come in slightly late or indeed anybody who didn't quite catch everything, we kind of kicked off with a presentation from Luca talking about security is difficult, actually, and explaining security notions, this idea of changing the language, changing the message, and of course, various other aspects of that. We talked about ransomware. Jason took us on a bit of a journey to help us understand the human impact of ransomware, and of course the orders of harm and the very, very real lessons that are being learnt from organisations. And then Sarah, who did an amazing talk on remote work and of course shadow security, and some of the insights and some of the lessons, I guess, that are being taken away from this period of time of intense remote work and hybrid work we've had. So a real range of things, all of which could be applied or discarded in equal measure. That's the truth of it when it comes to any sort of research. I wondered if I could kick off with you, Donna, picking up on you because you're rather foolishly still looking in my eyes. And just ask, of the things that we've just heard today, as a practitioner, when you think about kind of what might be applied, tell us what kinds of things kind of spring to mind for you, what's in mind?
I mean, we were actually just having a conversation. So in terms of fairy tales and applying them into the workplace, that's not going to work for everybody, depending on the organisation. And it all goes back down to audience and knowing your audience. I've got an audience of 30,000 people scattered across the globe. Some of them are very hard to reach in terms of the remote side of things, and some of them are easier to do that with. And it's just that context. So for me, it's not necessarily about the fairy tale itself, it's about the storytelling, and sometimes that's the most important part of it, and bringing people along on this journey of learning. Some of them are going to be ahead of that curve and some of them are way behind. So it's just bringing everyone along together in a really kind of, it's just that audience, some that will work with Cinderella and others will need another type of story. Or something really short as well. Some of them haven't got capacity for.
Yeah. What about you, Dee?
I totally agree with what Donna's just said. I think storytelling is a key part of awareness training, of communication, understanding your audience, as the four of us were discussing earlier, is that you need to know that people have a different way of learning. There'll be different levels, there'll be different styles. And if you can combine something like the storytelling in a way that meets your audience needs and aligns to their awareness levels, then you're on to a win. And it's always good to try something new. I do feel that at the universities we have professional staff, we have academic staff that might not resonate with the academic staff for a number of reasons. And Luca rightly touched on the fact that the credibility of that story and the way you use it is the important factor. So, yeah, I agree with that. I could use it as a way to communicate in conjunction with traditional training.
Yeah. James, you've not just been in the space for a while, but also look at risk more broadly, as you said in your kind of introduction. So I guess as you're listening to research into ransomware, something that presumably is something that you not only just know about professionally, but also think about, kind of how can we pull things from research into an area like ransomware, into what we do practically?
So I think what I took away from Jason's talk was very much about crisis management. It's almost being agnostic to the ransomware. It's about how do we deal with crises, full stop. And actually, you can take the business on a journey much easier, I believe, than just focusing on cyber ransom breaches. DLA suffered from NotPetya 2017, got wiped out. But it is about that crisis management all the way through. Then you can really build the resilience of the business. And I think that's where I think we're doing it better. And when we put people through scenarios, sometimes it is a cyber type event, sometimes it's a typhoon in the Australian office or whatever it might be, but it's getting the right people to look at it agnostic and train them agnostically. How are you going to deal with a crisis? And then that should help with the resilience of the firm.
And just maybe sticking with that, does the person or the people or the team, because I know it varies. We've got some people in the audience who are in organisations and they are a one-person band. And I know that there are some people in this audience in organisations where you're one of 20 people who are focused on the human aspect of cybersecurity. So it really is a range, and every organisation is obviously in a different place in the journey. I have heard some people say, where does that team, those people, that person, where does their remit start and stop? Ultimately, this is a human aspect, but as you said, managing crises and delivering crises. So what are your thoughts on that?
So co-sourcing, it's really important to, I think DLA is quite siloed. I think lots of enterprises are quite siloed, and it's trying to break across and influence the narrative as much as you can, and to drive those conversations. So I'm not a decision maker. I can't make these things happen, but I can influence and bring that to other people and other teams. So working with business continuity and working together, because if you are a small team, and we're only a team of 3, but we're looking after thousands and tens of thousands of people, then working with all those others who also deal with a crisis and coming together as one, then you're going to be more impactful and drive that conversation, which then helps the cyber element. It helps us all. So it's working together. I think.
Love it. Nick, the lecture that we haven't yet talked about, but ultimately was fantastic. We touched on remote working, shadow security. As you're listening to that type of research and thinking about application in the workplace, tell us what kinds of things spring to your mind.
I think it's interesting because there was one point on there that was about past experience, and it appeared to me, because I've had a colleague in the past who's worked in highly secure MOD style, aerospace style environments, and then when he moved workplace to somewhere that didn't have that level, he was shocked and he thought he had to take matters into his own hands. So shadow security either comes in 2 ways. I don't think it's good enough, right? Or I think that it's inconvenient, or I need to get around it. The thing that strikes me specifically in our organization is it comes down to leadership attitudes as well. So if your leadership are very laissez-faire about the policy regarding remote working, how many days you do it and how many days you are in the office, what's to say that they care about how you're securing your work at the same time when you're on that hybrid working policy? And we certainly notice that there are some people who spend a lot less time in the office and they're a lot less aware of what's expected of them in terms of those secure behaviours. So then the challenge becomes making sure that you can reach them. So when they get their coffee in the morning, they just lift the laptop lid up and it awakes exactly where it was. You know, they don't have a big homepage that says, this is your latest security update. It's how do you make sure that you keep getting the notifications through to those people and getting it to sink in that just because you're not in the office doesn't mean you don't have to play by our rules. So yeah, that was, the research is very insightful. I'm very grateful to receive that.
Yeah. I'm going to, like I said, open it up because I'm keen that we have the opportunity for people to shout out their thoughts. But I'm conscious that lots of people would have been listening, and I just wondered whether anybody would be willing to just give us a very quick, and it is very quick, thought on what kind of struck you as a practitioner. If you are somebody who's kind of in an organisation trying to manage human risk, about some of the research. Anybody willing to share any thoughts on that? Oh my goodness. This never happens. There we go. This one, Sarah, please.
Yeah, one of the things that I was interested in about the storytelling is, I guess for people that have done security awareness or culture change for a long time, we might use that technique. But what about, it's obviously not going out in terms of how we communicate as organisations, how banks communicate, how TfL in that instance communicate, and how can we, in what we're doing, influence what's going out for wider communications across the organisation and out to public?
So you mean communications other than security, so or security comms going out to the organisation? Is that what you meant, Sarah?
Yeah. I mean, you know, are we influencing in security the communications that are going out to the public enough?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess all very different organisations. Some of you may get involved with security comms that go outside of the organisation as well as the comms inside. Has anybody got any experience of that?
Not specifically outside the org, but we are currently in a position where we're having to start to think about how we advise our partners, so whether it be couriers or restaurant partners, about their own security. So it's not quite public, but we're certainly having to think of strategies, because it's all well and good dealing with account takeover on our own platform, right, and making sure that our staff accounts aren't getting hit. But if all the restaurant partners out there suddenly lose access to their Just Eat account and they can't sell food for our platform, we do have that challenge. So if you do have any insights, I'd be really interested to have a discussion with you on that. But I don't know if anybody else has got public.
Not public, but like you, supply chain and encouraging them to think like marketeers. I think that's the most important part. Know your audience, know what message, going to Luke's point about how you phrase things, make it more accessible, understandable.
Yeah.
Stop hiding behind jargon.
Yeah. It is interesting because I think it is happening more and more. And I think we are certainly seeing it. I don't know, quick show of hands, who here in the room is responsible, or either in the team or as an individual, for communicating and training or educating and helping internally in your own organisation to manage cybersecurity risk? Just keep your hand up. How many people extend that to their supply chain or suppliers and contractors? Anybody? Anybody extend it to members of the public as well? So you can see it's a kind of, obviously fewer people, but the point that is interesting is we do know that practitioners are increasingly being asked to extend this bubble of security beyond just the internal team. So it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Did we have another one here?
Yeah, it was just a comment on the kind of external communications. So I joined a new role. So in December, I joined a company called Halion. I didn't have to do this, but I was brought into, I formally report into the CISO, but I have a dotted line into our corporate affairs team, i.e. external and internal comms. So any comms that go out either externally or internally are always reviewed and go via me if it's in relation to security. So I think that's quite a good way of having a kind of a guardrail around anything that goes out, ensuring that the messaging is right, it's landing. You know, we're creating a bit of scaffolding for users, trying to really get into the mind of who is this user, who is the stakeholder going to be involved here, and how do we scaffold to make sure that the information is relevant to them and actually it makes sense, or is it too technical, which historically, unfortunately, it has been far too technical. It doesn't actually mean anything. So just a comment around that public affairs piece.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. It's super helpful to hear. So we are kind of here because we're talking about the benefits of research and evidence. But I guess for the other members of the audience who maybe aren't necessarily in organisations thinking about how they manage risk for their organisations every day, but are actually thinking about research questions that they're trying to do, or trying to access real people with real data or real data subjects. How do they do that? How do researchers who are thinking about their next question best engage with a practitioner who is super busy, maybe in a team that's not particularly as staffed as much, and how do you interact with research, or how could we do it better rather than you tell us just how you are doing it?
So I've worked with Sarah before. We did research last August. I think it's coming out soon, hopefully, fingers crossed, or the first draft. I've reached out to universities, Royal Holloway and others, to offer our services because I want to bridge that gap between practitioners and academia to give them real life examples. And we've done it 3 times now in the 6 years.
And give us a feel for what that kind of entailed. What does that mean you as DLA do? What does that mean? Just help people understand a bit.
So it's working with the researcher on what they need from us to understand. Sometimes it's just a one-on-one interview. We did one with Royal Holloway, which was the gamification of lawyers. So we gave them access to some lawyers. And that informed our program. We brought in a lot more gamification because, funny enough, lawyers are very competitive. But it helped validate that and helped our business case to introduce new tools. And so it works in a symbiotic relationship. It gives them a lot of access to real live people and data to help their research and help with their studies, and gives us something which we can absolutely use.
Yeah, amazing. Anybody else, either beyond clearly necessarily attending a conference like this, have any experience of academia and or research? No. I think it's good to call out or good to talk about, because the reality is I think this is something that in many ways we have seen people aren't necessarily aware that they could do what James and team have done. Now, I also would suggest that there's a kind of time and a place as well. You kind of get your point to the point where you've got the capacity to even offer or indeed engage with, but something that we would love to just continue to encourage. I think, where's John McElhaney? I think I saw him at some point. He's there. Anyone who hasn't met John, please meet John, and indeed anybody who John has been the benefit of being taught by John. I'll just pick on John as one example. I remember us talking years ago about the fact that you're always crying out for access to people with real challenges, real questions, and of course, real people, real data. And equally, we've got lots of people who've got lots of questions and lots of challenges, not data, but don't necessarily have the time to think about it. So if you think about it, we talked, obviously, shadow IT, we talked about ransomware, we also talked about the way in which we communicate and the language that we use. Communications and language are often the kind of go-to focus point, and very necessarily so. It's such a big, much of what we do is communications. Dee, at OU, what percentage of your time is spent kind of focused on, if you were to try and put a number on it, kind of communicating and educating, and how much of it is doing anything else? And what does that mean? I'm just thinking in the context of kind of research, whether we should be putting more and more effort into communicating, focusing on our research and communication, or otherwise. What do you think?
Well, I'll have to tell you that since 2020, when COVID hit, we weren't doing very many webinars for cybersecurity. As soon as COVID hit, we were doing them. We were requested to do them as well by our staff every week for a period of about 3 months, because of this change that we were talking about earlier about suddenly being a remote worker. So you're an office-based worker, suddenly you have to decamp to your house, which you may not even have a desk at, or the right equipment, or the right routers, and suddenly you are placed in a different environment with family and children and everything else around you. So for us, the communication part ramped up no end, and I think, to answer your question, I spend probably 50% of my time on communications, getting the communications right, looking at new ways to communicate, looking at our different audiences, tailoring communications, probably the largest part of that 50%. The communications that go out are then followed up by webinars, so the two-way conversation to communicate to users. Then it's followed up with some cyber bites, which are really quick reminders, nudges through the CybSafe platform. And then we have a forum where people can come and talk to us about their issues, problem solve, look at new ways of working, talking about the policies that we were talking about when you're a remote worker, and Sarah mentioned. actually saying they didn't know this policy existed, or this policy exists, but they didn't know how to embed it in their activity that they do working remotely. So suddenly it's opened up a new area where there's a lot more two-way communication. We're understanding how our users are working differently, and that's differently to how they would have been if they were full-time in the office. So communication is absolutely a major part.
What about you, Donna?
Yeah,
Belron.
we spend a lot of time communicating, but I think it's just trying to it's airtime, right? And this is what we all fight with. And it's not just about cybersecurity, because tons of other noise and other things going on. So it's just trying to find the right hooks, space, needs. We were just talking about changing it up a bit, actually, and moving our comms more towards a social media kind of feed. So something that people are used to seeing. So the way the world is, that's how people get their information more and more now. So how do we implement that into the workplace? And we're just looking at ways we can do that. Nick sounds like he's way ahead on that. But
I wouldn't say way ahead.
but it's just looking at constantly reassessing, looking at what works, looking at what doesn't, trying things with different audiences, but knowing that people are overconsumed, just so much information in our lives. So how it's just balancing that and fit it in. But equally, there's repetition's really important.
Yeah.
And I also think we need to get smart about how we communicate. We do a lot of co-sourcing. So if the tax team will feed it into their comms, so they're presenting it. It's not always have to be us. I think that we get quite precious about it being our message and everything else. But actually, if you can weave it in, if they're learning and it feels like it's part of their world, it feels more part of their workflow. So it doesn't need to be so dramatic and in your face, because the airtime is the biggest problem. They've got so many, they've got to do their jobs. And now you're wanting them to do this and that. I think in weaving it, understanding the workflow, understanding the audiences and weaving the comms into that, so then it feels part of the culture. We talk about culture a lot, but it seems a bit disjointed. InfoSec are saying this, Risk are saying that. I mean, as soon as you hear risk compliance or things like that, you just back off. So actually, if you weave it in different ways,
I think it's about when you weave it in as well.
Totally.
So, like, your attitude to what you want to do on a Friday is very different to what you want to do on a Monday. At 4 o'clock on a Friday, I am looking at my phone and wondering when's the next bus that gets me to the pub. But on a Friday morning, I'm looking to do things like the personal development tasks, things that are light-hearted, maybe a bit of admin, things that I don't have to overwork my brain too hard on a Friday, potentially. And a lot of people do that. They have personal development mornings on a Friday. So slipping your comms into or your messaging into certain days. So, for example, tomorrow I'm going to put a reminder out, please go and do your annual awareness training. And while you're at it, why don't you come and look at this video that we made for our series called Threatflix. We've just made the 4th episode. So while you're doing both of those things, that's a nice Friday morning while you're having your coffee and croissant or whatever pastry of choice you might have. So time of day makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And that relevancy as well, just making sure it's relevant to them.
One of the challenges that has always struck me about our space is the kind of the nuance. You know, the reality is there's not a thing that we can talk about that in its and of itself couldn't be an hour-long discussion. What is security culture, and exactly what does that actually mean? Security behaviours is something that we all talk about. But the reality, we often use the same language but mean slightly different things. But when it comes to research and when it comes to an evidence base, specificity matters, because you can't really answer a question if you can't at least define the type of thing. So in many ways, it strikes me that there's a bit of a clash is probably too strong a word, but you get my point. In kind of within the job, you can get away with, indeed maybe even necessarily need to be a bit vague. If you're too pedantic about something, no one's going to listen. But then conversely, within the academic community, we need to be quite specific. What are we actually trying to test here, measure here, work out here? Is that good? Is that a problem? Is that a challenge? Should I stop thinking about it?
No, I think it's right. It is a good challenge. I think that's why we moved away from InfoSec, was because we want people to be risk agnostic. The research about hybrid working, well, that's about situational awareness. We have lawyers who travel. I don't care whether they're at home, in the office, or on a train. They need to be situationally aware. Now, how do you change someone's awareness to their situation? That's around behaviours and habits and all those great things. But So as vague as we are, we're learning from the specifics to then see how we can apply that. So I think it's really useful, but it is a contradiction.
Sometimes vague is what you need to, if you're too prescriptive about what you're saying, then ultimately that won't land with certain people who just want to read a headline. You know, I think again we were saying earlier about time. Being vague sometimes is quicker than being in great amounts of detail and bullet points that people need to read, which is another reason why looking at alternative medias other than just an article here and there is probably a good way to deliver that vagueness with more personality as well.
But the counter is that if you are looking at specific behaviour to change, you just want to focus on that and actually not cover so many other things. Right, we're doing cloud security and passwords and this and that. No, it's just one thing we need to deal with. Then it's really valuable to be specific. But then it's also looking at the audiences who may be falling foul of that and not sheep dipping everyone in the firm. So understand the behaviours, which is what your platform does really well, because then you can target it.
I haven't paid James to say that. I did pay a few other people to say that, but that's extremely. No, I think it's, again, the beauty of this type of conversation is these things, they span, they sit far above any particular technology or even approach. I mean, really, we're talking about just some quite conceptual things here. Maybe another question to the audience, which might elicit something that you'd be willing to share with us, which is, as you have listened to the talks that happened earlier on, again, 3 people talking about research that was done, but then sharing the insights. Are they things that you heard? Did anybody hear anything there that they thought, actually, I hadn't thought about that like that before? Because there would have been lots of things you thought, actually, I knew that beforehand, but I hadn't thought about that before. Did anybody put your hand up if that was you? And yes, you are right. I am going to pick on some people. Tell us, what did you think about that you hadn't thought about before?
I think it was Jason's presentation about ransomware and about the soft approach. I think we probably do quite well in crisis management, but when I think back about the plans, I don't think we consider the people who would call in about their needs and making sure they are cared for through that process. So that's what I'm going to take away and check.
Next of that type of crisis or ransomware, obviously I know the team, but many people here won't know where you are or indeed your team. Is that you have a role to play? You know you have a role to play. You just hadn't thought about that aspect of the role. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think if I think about the plans we do, everybody has their set role and the what they bring to that table in that crisis moment. But I think it's the care around that, the people sitting at that table, and making sure that there's somebody maybe nominated to be like, guys, you've been at 12 hours on this. You're out, new people come in, and being that kind of manager of the table, I think is quite a concept that I'm going to take back.
Brilliant. Incident response is something that many organisations here will be extremely familiar with, dealing with it differently in organisations, but hopefully, possibly, presumably practicing it as well. So these are really good examples of things that can be weaved into practicing clearly beforehand. The idea that somebody specifically, their job is to make sure that we're not going to fall over and we're actually going to be able to stand the time, the incident that is running.
Yeah, purple teaming is really important for the SOC team to do. It was the one kind of question. But my experience of talking to SOC members is they love a crisis. They've been training, and CrowdStrike was a perfect example where they were like, oh my God, something's happening. Because all the, exactly. It's what they've been trained for. So they get overexcited sometimes about,
That's what they've been waiting for.
Exactly.
Yeah, really good. Well, if we're going to, I guess, as a community of practitioners, policymakers, and researchers, which of course is what we are in this particular room, but also lots of people watching and looking at this elsewhere. If we're going to get better at reaching into and leveraging research, what would you suggest we do? What is it that if you had infinite time, if you had infinite resource, or maybe even just infinite access to Sarah's, Jason's and Luca's of the world, you would be kind of just one thing. I know the list is probably endless, but just what could we do to just be better at leaning into research?
Embedding you folks in the orgs at points.
Yeah.
If you're there doing the research and being able to witness it as it happens, witness the real world as we're living in it, there's much more chance of you being able to potentially help us in ways to translate that into practical methodologies. I think we hear a lot of the very similar key takeaways that are summed up at the end of decks sometimes, and it often is a lot deeper than that when you're actually in the org, and they come with lots of different caveats as well. So, not being too specific, but
yeah, I think we carry our own biases, and having an academia look at it, they're telling us what we don't know, and that's really useful.
This idea of embedding researchers into organisations, either permanently, actually I know some teams have done that, or indeed even for periods of time, is really interesting, because I know that's something that I certainly feel like I'm seeing a lot more now than maybe we were 5, 6, 7 years ago. But anybody here have experience of having either, I guess, professional researchers in their organisations, either for short periods of time or for long periods of time? Or indeed, if you are one that has been embedded into an organisation, maybe just pop your hand up. One. No, there's at least a couple of you, because some of you have been sent from us. Yeah, really interesting. And yeah, thank you for doing it. It's something that we definitely think is happening. I think is happening more and more. But the truth of the matter is, knowing where to turn to is going to be another thing. And I think that's something we can do as a community. Please, if you could take this away, this would be very helpful. There are a lot of researchers out there who would give an arm to come and spend time in your organisation. They just don't know where to start or how to do it. And equally, if you are studying, writing about, or planning on publishing on something, it's probably going to be much, much better if you could get yourself as close as you can do to organisations who have this problem. So I think as a community we can help each other on that front. What else? What else can we do to better leverage research and academia, specifically and rather selfishly, to help people who are literally living these problems all day, every day? Well, I say problems, they're not problems actually in many cases, they're just challenges, they're opportunities to overcome things that are necessary problems.
I mean, for us, it's, we have so much data, tons of it, and I haven't got time to trawl through it. I've got, we can pick points and we can pick maybe riskier areas and try and find those groups that are slightly more risky, and then look at how our training's impacting them. And it's just that whole journey piece, and it takes so much time while you're doing the comms, while you're, you've got some alert that's coming in that you've got to send out, while you've got, so actually to have that room and that space, it's a really interesting thought actually, because I think maybe we have the data, actually, if we get somebody in to have a look at that and steer that, it's just, I mean, there was millions of questions that I could probably ask them to look into. I mean, right now we're looking at, the basics of clicking on emails and who's most susceptible and where the riskier areas are and how we can support those people and how better we support those people, what's working, what's not. So just as an example, that's kind of the basics, but just how to kind of constantly improve their programme, and basing it on evidence is, the data is so important, and then no one can challenge that really, because you're standing, to the senior people of an organisation, you're going, well, these are the facts. It's really valuable. So,
one of the things that is particularly powerful about the research community and any research that takes place is this kind of concept of a literature review. Before anybody even goes away and does anything, they will have a good look about what has been done beforehand. It's hilarious and indeed slightly concerning, actually, when doing the job, how often we forget that. We're rarely thinking or scrabbling with something that somebody else hasn't thought about, or indeed maybe even got and written about. So finding a way to kind of make whatever the practitioner equivalent of literature reviews is more easily done is something I think we could really learn from. I think I saw a hand come up. Maybe Ali, was that you? Yeah.
Yeah, just what you're saying about the data really resonated, because having worked across lots of different industries doing this kind of work, there's always can we have a dashboard? Just give us a dashboard. That's all we need. Just a dashboard and everything will be fine. And of course, dashboards are great, and there are great tools that can help us to discover that. But I think the biggest challenge in linking researchers with practitioners is that our bosses are rarely willing to give away that data to the researchers. And what would be the holy grail for me would be finding a way that we can standardize the terms that we use so that we can do a data review as opposed to a literature review. So come up with those commonalities and have the researchers whose job it is to go and dive into data and really think about it and come up with new research questions. We need to give them the data to do that on without it necessarily impinging on any commercial secrecy or all those kinds of things. So finding a way to anonymize specific sets of data and then bring it together in a 10-year ago big data conversation, if you like. Yeah. But if there's a way that we can do that, maybe by industry or country or whatever the particular dynamic is, if we can find that common ground, that would be super valuable. So because so many of us get asked by our bosses, well, what's the rest of the industry doing? What are our competitors doing? And I think that's where if we can get that agnostic data that's been managed through an academic lens, it'll be easier to have those conversations.
Yeah, fascinating. Indeed.
I think academia can give us context on that data, because data out of context means nothing, really. Yes. It's really understanding, getting to the root causes and all those that actually gives the data a lot more power, and then we can utilise that with our bosses and their conversations.
Yes. I remember an old boss who once said to me that the problem is everybody is data-driven, but nobody's data literate. Yes. And of course, there is a challenge with that. Data used in the wrong way is actually really rather unhelpful. So this is fantastic. Final question before we.
Go on, John.
Sorry, I'm going to do that horrible more of a point than question, but I think there's actually a very fundamental problem, and this may not be the venue for it, but ultimately, there is a conflict in philosophy between an organisation and a researcher, or an academic researcher. And this touches on Ali's point about the agnosticism, because any firm that I have worked for will say, what's in it for me to give that data away? Because that data has value to us, and our purpose is adding value, profit, whatever you want to call it. And or I'm going to give that away and I'm going to make us more vulnerable, and that's going to have an impact on our bottom line, etc. And I don't know how we get across that. And I guess maybe that's the question to the panel. How do we tie those two ostensibly competing philosophies together enough that we do start getting the willingness to share and so on? Because otherwise it's well, I'd love to know what everyone else is doing, but I'm not willing to contribute what we're doing to that effort.
So how we dealt with that was the researchers created their own data within the organisation, and it was anonymous. We couldn't use it. All we could see was the output of it. But it kept that was what worked for us, because again, we had the same problems that John and Ali are talking about, not being able to hand over for GDPR, privacy and everything else. But if they generated their own with the permission of the people they're interviewing, it's their data.
I would offer that this challenge is a challenge, but it's more logistical than it is a problem at the principal level. And I think there's some really good examples actually of where we have overcome this exact challenge. If I was to look outside of security, and I think it's important that we do that quite a lot, in healthcare we have competing healthcare providers and organisations sharing patient health data, which is essentially not just extremely valuable, it costs them a lot of money to get access to that data in the first place, but also quite important in the context of kind of maintaining an edge and developing something they're going to commercialise in the future. But they share it, and they share it because they know that they benefit more than just having access to their own. And so, as you say, there does need to often be a what's in it for me, but the what's in it for me exists, and explaining it well. Actually, closer to home, security, a great example would be threat intelligence and the ISACs, which again, organizations started by saying, well, why would I, one, expose the fact that I have had this challenge, two, tell other people, I literally take the time to share, which is time I'm giving away that I could be spending, the opportunity cost of the time. But again, the collective benefit being seen. But of course, there had to be a period where they had to get over that hump in the first place, I'm assuming, or get enough people and get a mass. So I would just encourage us to keep trying to answer the question that you asked, John, but also take heart from the fact that it has been done. And just because it hasn't yet been done in our space, and I'm saying this having not done the literature review, actually there might be some quite good examples of where data is being shared in this way, which we could tap into. But I suspect even if that hadn't been done in our space yet, doesn't mean it couldn't be. I'm being waved at quite frantically with bits of paper that have all sorts of numbers on, which means that we no longer have 5 or 2 or 1 minute left. We should just shut up. But thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you hugely to the panel for coming up. I do think that there's something quite, again, as we said, it's bold hearing from researchers to come up and talk. I think it's even bolder in some ways for practitioners to come up and talk about research, because many people sit and think, I feel like a fraud. I don't spend much time digging into or listening to or read lots of research. But the truth is, this is what we're here for, really, because people who have the problem or live the problem or understand these problems, actually talking to people who think about these things, think about them deeply, and are able to research about them. That's really what we're trying to do. So please join me in thanking the panel. Our panel of panellists.